Okay, very short video here discussing type 1 and type 2 errors when we're talking about hypothesis tests. So recall in a hypothesis test, the first step was stating the hypothesis, the null hypothesis, and the alternative hypothesis. It took one of several different forms. If we were talking about means, the null hypothesis was that the unknown population mean equaled some hypothesized value of that mean versus the alternative, which could take one of three forms depending on the question. Either that the population mean doesn't equal that value we thought, which we call a two-sided alternative. This one is a two-sided alternative, whereas these two are called one-sided alternatives, right? Either the unknown population mean doesn't equal the value we think going in, or we are looking for evidence that it's greater than that value, or we're looking for evidence that it's less than that value. So that's another good point to bring up. The alternative hypothesis is what you're trying to find evidence for. Okay, again, go back to the jury example. Null hypothesis is innocence. Alternative is guilty. You are looking for evidence to change your mind about the null hypothesis, and only when you're presented with overwhelming evidence determined by the level of significance do we change our mind about that null hypothesis. So we go into the test with an idea either about a mean or about a proportion. Population proportion equals some hypothesized value. Again, the three possible alternatives, a two-sided alternative or the one-sided alternatives greater than or less than. So when we talk about type 1 and type 2 errors, a type 1 error is rejecting the null hypothesis when it is in fact true. I mean, we're going to make errors. There's a certain statistical probability that our conclusion on our hypothesis test is going to be wrong. Right? We have to accept this. And the type 1 error is the error of rejecting the null hypothesis when it is in fact true. And the probability of that type 1 error is the level of significance that we set at the beginning of the test. This is how often we're willing to make that type 1 error. Right? If we set the alpha level at 0.1, then we know 10% of the time we're going to make a mistake. We're going to reject the null hypothesis when it is in fact true. If we want to reduce that chance of a type 1 error, we make the alpha level smaller. If we have an alpha level of 0.01, then we're only going to make this error 1 out of 100 times on average. So the level of significance will tell you how often you're going to make a type 1 error. And going back to the jury example, this would be finding a person guilty when they're actually innocent, right? Finding a person guilty when they're actually innocent. That would be a type 1 error. We want to avoid type 1 errors. We don't want to reject the null hypothesis when it's true. We want to avoid that as much as possible. That's why we have these alpha levels at very low numbers, right? Usually the highest one is 0.1 or 10%. Generally 0.05, 5% of the time we're going to make a type 1 error. But by doing that, you got to understand there's a balance here. By reducing the chance of a type 1 error, we're necessarily increasing the chance of a type 2 error. And again, think of the jury example. In our, ideally, we don't want to send innocent people to jail. Right? So we make exceptions to make sure, or to at least in theory, try to reduce the chance of sending innocent people to jail. Now, by doing that, we necessarily increase the chance of accepting the null when it's false, or finding guilty defendants not guilty. We require an overwhelming amount of evidence in our jury system to say that that null hypothesis of innocence is not true. In the same way here, we set a level of significance to say what amount of evidence we need to change our mind about the null hypothesis and go to one of the alternatives. So a type 2 error is accepting the null when it is in fact false. So accepting the idea that someone is innocent when in fact they're not, because we don't have enough evidence to change our mind. Now, the probability of a type 2 error is a little beyond this class's level of calculating it out. It's a kind of a complex calculation, but the probability of a type 2 error is sometimes called the power of the test. Or actually, sometimes in books, it's labeled as a capital beta in Greek letter beta. But we won't concern ourselves with finding the probability of a type 2 error. We just want to know the definition of the type 2 error and the definition of the type 1 error. And we do know the probability of the type 1 error. That's the level of significance. Okay, so know what a type 1 error is, know what a type 2 error is, know the definitions and how they apply. All right, quick video.